So next week we're going to be doing postmodernism, I think. Let me see.
All right, that's good.
So I know you're doing a paper on that.
Yeah.
Let me get that syllabus up.
I know the Mun reading was not fun for me because the whole space-time concept
Yeah, that seemed like
way
your.
too, yeah, it was all over the place, and I wasn't sure if it was meaning necessarily a product or the entire system or both.
Yeah, and I think if I was going to do it again, I would switch postmodernity and economic, because you kind of once again have a little bit of postmodern influence in there. We'll talk about those a little bit later, right? But this is all this stuff comes out of the same era, right? After,
Mhm.
so like in the 60s and 70s, right, we got uh, environmental anthropology, and we got kind of the materialist turn that way. We did a whole unit on that. We also have that whole kind of economic side that comes out. We skipped Wallerstein as one of the ones we could have read this week, but it's like this Marxist kind of world system theory. It's similar to what we read
Mhm.
in Eric Wolf. So
Mhm.
we got at least a taste of that economic Marxism from the 70s, right?
Mhm.
So in the 80s, there's this what we call the postmodern turn, and we'll read about that coming up next week or the week after, and kind of transforms not only just economic anthropology, but all the different parts of anthropology, right? And it's focused on the author of the writing, more than just like the objective observer, and focused on ethnographies as a text that could be interpreted just like you could do literary interpretations of Hamlet or Beowulf or something,
Yeah.
do that with. I went to a workshop that was like Malinowski's journals, the postmodern critique. So we were like, oh, what is Malinowski thinking, based on his journals and stuff. So we'll talk all about that. But when we get to economic anthropology, there is kind of uh, some of those ideas come over, and there's like a lot of mixing with other ideas that we've talked about before, like Geertz, with like Levi-Strauss's structuralism, and like Geertz's interpretivism, taking the Marx stuff and then mixing it with some um, Durkheim, and especially Mose. Mose gets super popular back at this time. Like we read Mose kind of a long time ago, right? Like back in the Malinowski week.
Mhm.
So he's popular during that era and kind of goes away for a while, and then is rediscovered in the like late 70s, early 80s is like a super cool dude, because people start to do interesting things with that. Looking at his stuff with ritual and his stuff with um, non-capitalist economic systems. And we've talked about gift exchange quite a bit before, and I think you've even done a video about it. But all four of these works really kind of touch on Mose. I think it's like the central connecting piece. Um, and his look at both the Ring and the potlatch, and I think we see that pop up in um, a number of different
Yeah.
ones. And we started, I think you started on your review, but which I don't remember if they were in a certain order, with Chris Gregory's 1980 Gifts
Mhm.
and Commodities. Um, so what did you think about that one? We'll start with that one.
Let me get my view up as well. I'm pretty sure it was all right. Mhm. Oh, yeah, it was really interesting. Um, I had never really heard of the assumption that the like gifts between people were preparing them for the capitalist ideas, but at the same time, I could kind of see it, and then it made with that article, I could see, yeah, it makes even more sense if you pin that on the gifts to the gods thing, because then they get used to sacrificing capital type thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I don't know if it's necessarily good to think about it like an evolutionary model. Like that might be too far to be like this, like
Yeah.
prepares, you know. But they're definitely one of the cool things about Gregory is that he talks about how we have, you know, in like a Mostian, if we were going to teach like most of the undergrads, it'd be like capitalism is like this, and gift giving is like this, right? They're
Mhm.
opposites. One is between objects and one is between people. One is alienable versus one is inalienable, and all these different things, right? But what we see in Gregory is that they're really connected, right? And
Mhm.
we can think about that in our own society, right? You, if you're going to give somebody a birthday gift, you could make it yourself, or you could buy it at Walmart, right? So you can engage in the whole. So he has this great thing with. So in Marx, we have this like hierarchy of creation of value, right? The bottom being barter. He calls it C to C prime. Like have something and I give it to you.
Mhm.
On the higher level is exchange for something you want. I have a shoe. I sell it in the market, get $5 and go buy bread. The higher level, so that's C, commodity, M to money, C again. You know, so you have a commodity, I trade it for money, and I get something else. The higher level above that is the opposite, M, C, M. What do you think that would be?
Mo- Probably money to commodity, then back to money because this thing has a value in
So,
the money.
so how would that play out in the market? The money to money. How is that opposite of the commodity, money, commodity chain?
If I remember correctly, it's something along the lines of, in their case, it's like you have the commodity, and it's equal to the same thing. In the highest level, it's this thing has a value, so I could possibly sell all these things to
Yeah.
get all these other things.
So yeah, in the money to money sphere, it's like I'm an entrepreneur. I have $100,000. I want to get rich. Well, how do you want to get rich? I don't care. I just want to do something. Maybe I'll open a sub shop. Maybe I'll sell vitamins. Maybe I'll sell cars. I don't care. Right. So you have money. I invested in something. I don't care what it is. I want more money. That's what I want. Right. And then the highest level is M to M prime, which is like, I'm a bank. I got money. I give you money. You give me more money back. That's great. I make money without having to do anything. So it's this hierarchy from barter, commodity, money, to entrepreneurial money, to bank money. And so what Gregory did was he took that system and he mashed it into the most system of exchange of gift exchange. You know, where you have a gift and you exchange it and then you have to pay it back later with interest. And he shows how if you are buying someone a birthday present, you're operating in the one sphere, but you lock into the I have money, or work. I sell my labor is the first C for
Mhm.
money at my job. They give me $50. I buy you a birthday present. I take that commodity out of the commodity side of things and push it over to the gift side of things. And so he shows, I think in the Papua New Guinea examples, right, how a couple different ways that works, right, with the religious thing, um, giving money to God, especially, and it becomes almost potlatch like where you have the different clans competing. And so it's interesting. You have this, again, this relationship between kinship and economics, right? Both the potlatch and this kind of church competition is extended kin systems, right? And that's kind of seems like another distinction you have in those societies, right? And as we go more towards capitalism, you start to see those things start to become more individualized versus kind of collectivized.
Yeah, and I think he
Um,
also makes a point of some of the reason that a lot of the previous anthropologists couldn't understand this system is because it's not just one system, it's
yeah,
several.
yeah. And I think it's good because he goes, a lot of this stuff is in Papua New Guinea or Polynesia, because that's like the Kula area, and they have like a lot of cool, interesting economic systems. But the point is that like you can go far away and see this, but it helps you kind of see that we're not just capitalist maximizers.
Hmm.
Why would you give someone a birthday present if we are capitalist maximizers? It's illogical, or at least it leads to the assumption that you're just have a value, a dollar sign on each person in your life, versus like, these things can create alliances or do other things, reinforce social bonds or whatever. Um,
Reminds me of this one video series I watched that was like all the weird, out of the central frame ideologies, and one of them was anarchic capitalism,
uh-huh.
where it's all just the everything has a price, and it was hilarious to watch that character because I'm like, well, it's hilarious in the uncomfortable way of, oh yeah, this is why we need checks on capitalism.
Yeah, definitely. Everyone who's like super libertarian has never lived in a place that's really libertarian. Like in Belize, they're really libertarian and they're like, oh, your bridge washed out to your town. Pick yourself up by your bootstraps and fix it yourselves. Like, but we're like dirt farmers and now we can't go to town to like sell our things. Or like, you want a hospital, you're all dying, well, like raise some money and try to like buy yourself a doctor from somewhere. So yeah, it's just usually people, it seems like a good idea until you have to actually live it.
Yeah.
But yeah, and so I think Gregory is good, and he's a real cool, interesting way of thinking about this these two separate, bringing back this old idea of Mos and then mixing it with the Marxist idea of kind of capitalist relationships, and how that actually works in these societies. Like it's very similar to, I think it builds well off Eric Wolf's stuff, right? So he says we need to think about these peripheral societies and like focus on them, but like how do you do that, or like what does that actually look like, instead of just like that's a great idea, like more than and we see that with Wolf and Solomon, they do it historically, but they don't like get at the actual structure of how that
Mhm.
actually works, right? And this one, and we'll talk about Tausig next, kind of really do that. I think is like dig down into the structure of these. I don't know if you'd call them hybrid societies or societies that are straddling two different systems, right? And just like
Mhm.
we see with Gregory talking about Papua New Guinea, right? This is like South America that is actively being colonized, right? This is like Spanish colonialism. And you have all these different people, ranging from indigenous people in the Andes, which he talks about with the mining, to the like Afro-Caribbean people on kind of the northern side of the continent, who are like peasant farmers. And the way that like they think about and interact with capitalism, and I think is really interesting, right? And what is that? What is the salient metaphor within capitalism?
The thing that comes to mind probably is not the metaphor, but I remember the whole
It's in the
thing of
title of the book.
with Gregory still.
What? No, it's Michael Tausig.
That's how sick. Um, oh yeah, devil and commodity, and how it's kind of the salient thing for describing that is that they're uncomfortable with this stuff, so therefore it must be evil, and it represents a conversion to stuff. Or
Yeah,
like,
right. So the metaphor is the devil, um, and the way that the devil stands in for capitalism, right? And the like ceaseless. It's also very Marxist, right? And it's
mhm.
Marxist in a way, but it's also like it marries that with like both postmodernism and like a Geertzian interpretivist anthropology, right? Like
Yeah, I can see that.
the symbol or the metaphor is what's important here, right? It's you can go to a society of people who are forced to work in these Spanish silver mines, and you're like, what do you think about capitalism? We're like, it sucks, right? We have to work in the mines. But like, versus if you go, what do you think of, they're talking about their experience in the mines, and they talk about it in this metaphor of the devil, right? Especially in terms of like sacrifices to the devil, which is really interesting because if you think back to Mose again, right? Mose has this two things, right? His two things that he's famous for is this like exchange between people, gift exchange, right? The Kula gift
Mhm.
exchange, where I give you something and my fame goes with you. Fame we'll talk about with Nancy Munn again. Um, versus, but it's not alienated, right? And it has to be paid back with interest at a later time. But
Mhm.
sometimes you can't, like in the potlatch, right? You can't pay it back. That's the game, is to like not pay it back, right? And so then you
Mhm.
win prestige or fame. There's a hierarchy. And so gift giving is interesting because it seems like one of those things that makes people equal. I give you something, you give me something back. But for most and other people like that, it's one of these things that is um, the switch between like an egalitarian society to a hierarchical society is part of that gift giving exchange. So the other thing that Mose talks about is religion. So it's a weird combo. You're like, why economics and religion together? But he structures it in a way of sacrifice, right, and ritual,
Mhm.
and that in a sacrifice you're giving to God, and it's almost like a potlatch ceremony, but you can never give up, right? Because like in our Christian belief, right? God gives His Son who has sacrificed, and it's a gift that humans can never pay back, right? And we see this in a
Mhm.
lot of societies. It's why supernatural is supernatural and not just another person. They operate on another plane. So he says that it's the same mechanism pretty much of exchange, of gift giving exchange and ritual sacrifice. And um, he writes a book with Luke DeHirsch about sacrifice in Africa, which is all about that. Um, but here in Michael Tausig's book, we see the same thing going on, right? The same marriage of economics and religion, which is again, like, it's kind of interesting.
Mhm.
Um, but it's in a negative value, right? This is, instead of like the positive, thinking of Nancy Munn, who we'll get to in a little bit, right? The positive transformations of value, where
Mhm.
I give, God has created whatever gods have created this earth, and they give us beautiful earth. And I, as a farmer, give sacrifices. I sacrifice a goat, hope that they give us some rain, right? That's a positive transformation. They give, I give, they give, right? But in the Tausig, it's opposite. It's almost like um, Nancy Munn talking about witchcraft, your negative transformation. The capitalist mind wants more. It's hungry,
Mhm.
right? And I used to live in West Virginia, and there's kind of a similar thing about mines there that they're like hungry, right? And you're taking things out of the earth, but it kind of needs a sacrifice. Like, people
Mhm.
die in mining accidents, and that's kind of a thing that happens, right? And it's
Yeah.
almost like the mine itself is a thing that's hungry for people or things, right? And it becomes a metaphor for capitalism, right? The capitalist system is hungry. It's Our economy has to grow in order to be considered healthy, right? If an economy is like equal and then like perfectly stable, the president's probably going to lose his job, right? You need to like be growing the economy at all times. Businesses are the same way. They always need to be growing, right? If you have if you have a company on the stock exchange and it's not growing, people are going to dump your stock, right? Even if you're like 100%. And the mines are the same way, right? And the other example he uses is these Afro-Caribbean people who work on plantations along like the Colombian, Venezuelan coast.
Yeah.
And he says that it's interesting because we don't see that devil metaphor among people who are basically peasant farmers, people, same culture, but own their own land and grow primarily for the household versus work on a sugarcane plantation for someone else for wages. So why do you think that is? Why do you think that we see these devil metaphors? Same people, same culture, same time period. Why is there devil metaphors in this one and not the other, do you think?
I mean, in the general sense, it would be once again like feeding the capitalist machine type thing.
Mm-hmm. Versus if
Um,
you are a peasant farmer, what are you doing?
you're just kind of farming to survive and doing, I think, as it kind of says about some of the anecdotes of how these people work, like they just want the uh, minimum stuff to survive. They don't drive it further to gain capital type thing.
Yeah, and so if we were going to do more on economics, we'd read Richard Wilkes' stuff about peasants and peasant households in Belize, right? And he says that they are primarily focused on like self-sufficiency of the household, right? Reproduction of kinship systems versus reproduction of capital, right? Or making more money.
Yeah.
That's why you see lots of, people have lots of kids and they'll be really interested in social things like godparenthood and, fictive kin and uncles and aunts, because that's where you get your strength in those communities, is not from how much money you have, but how many people you can mobilize in a fight or a political ballot or, social
Mm-hmm.
engagement, right? Um, so yeah, we don't see these devil metaphors, and it becomes a salient way for like these cultures to talk to us as ethnographers about like what they think about these structures and what they think about capitalism, like global capitalism in an Eric Wolf sense, right? So what
Mm-hmm.
does the Eric Wolf Europe and a People Without a History, right? What does it look like from their perspective? This is like Geology Spivak talking about subaltern speaking, right? What does it look like when how do these systems look from the perspective of a third world person, looking out and up at global capitalism? What is their
Very
perspective?
immoral and like destroying the family in a certain sense as well.
Yeah,
Just completely shifting the entire point of life for them.
yeah. It's a scathing critique, right? It's not a very positive one. And so it's an interesting way to like critique capitalism. And we'll talk a little bit about David Graeber and his critiques of capitalism in a minute. But a lot of these are kind of critiques of capitalism in its current form. And a good way to do that is to instead of like me telling you capitalism can like destroy people's families,
Mm-hmm.
use these ethnographic examples to talk about like, they construct the mind as the devil, and devil needs blood to produce silver. And,
Mm-hmm.
this is basically what they think about us in this system. And it's interesting. He ties it into these like um, explanations, especially with like, again, Malinowski,
Mm-hmm.
going back to him, and George Foster, who actually worked in the same area I did, Southern Belize, with limited good, right?
Mm-hmm.
I have this idea that, especially before kind of capitalism, like villages are really isolated. It took like a
Mm-hmm.
week to like walk your stuff by donkey to market. So there was this idea that like the economy was like a pie and everybody gets a slice. And if you have more slices than I have, then I get less, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that capitalism basically blows that up or hooks that pie into a pie factory somewhere else that you sell your labor or something, right? um, but that it becomes a way of like speaking about scarcity, right? Or people taking too much, greediness and jealousy. And oftentimes, for people like Foster, it's tied into this idea of witchcraft, which we'll talk about. So I guess we can do Nancy Munn next, since we're already talking about this. But this idea of witchcraft, and witchcraft as an economic leveling mechanism, right? And a lot of societies, peripheral societies, I guess you'd say, right? There's an increase in witchcraft as the economy becomes more integrated in capitalism, right? And this seems like almost counterintuitive from like a modern U.S. perspective. You're like, they should be becoming more rational, right, or uh, more scientifically based. But who knows about that anymore, right?
Yeah.
Um, but the idea is like it's really interesting. And so why do you think that we would see an increase in witchcraft around the same time you see increased integration into capitalism?
It's in a similar sense to the devil metaphor of like now that everyone, the way that they prove value in that society is because they have more capital. It's doing more stuff to get their part of perhaps a concept of limited good, but not necessarily.
Yeah. And it's also used as a way to like level people back down, right? The idea that
Yeah.
if you get too much, I can't like go and, stab you. I mean, I could, but that's probably bad. But I
Hmm.
could, I'll probably do a witchcraft on you, or I will, hire a sorcerer to like bring disease and pestilence to your animals or something, or have your daughter run off with some soldier man from another village, and something bad would
Yeah, and
happen to you.
the unintentional evil eye
Yeah,
that if you do too much, someone becomes jealous, and that
yeah,
jealousy becomes witchcraft.
yeah. And that's an underlying force in Maya society. It's something I've written a little bit about, right? And how that's changed now with like Protestantism. Um, So like in my stuff, that's exactly the system that used to happen. But then the Protestants came in and they said that, that old witchcraft stuff doesn't work anymore. And you should be good capitalist instead of being like this peasant mentality. You need to like invest. You need to like, you know, you got 10 cacao trees. You should have 20 acres and then you could make money. And they're like, well, for what? And they're
Mhm.
like, but you could buy all this cool stuff, And I'm like, okay. Um, and so there's this whole kind of thing in the village now between people who like believe in witchcraft and those who are like, I don't believe that anymore. I'm a
Mhm.
good Christian slash capitalist now, and I'm outside of that system of limited good and witchcraft, right? Um, but then something will happen to them, and people will be like, they got witchcraft. So it becomes a question of belief, like they believe they say like I don't believe in that, and you'll be like, what happened to that person? And they're like, oh, that person got witchcraft, but I don't believe in it. Like, but you just said that like they got witchcraft, like you didn't say that they got sick or that misfortune or chaos happened or something, like. So it's about like actively denying not only that religious system but that like whole
Gosh,
system
what's
of
the term for
values,
that?
right? And so
Holding
it's
two
similar
contradictory ideas. What's the term for that?
for what?
Holding two contradictory ideas. I know it's not dissociation. That's not quite it. I forget the term. Anyway.
Um, but yeah, it's similar to Nancy Munn stuff, right? Fame of Gawa. This is like the same era. Some of this like first 1976 kind of first post-moderny economic-y stuff, right? Taking
Mhm.
economics to the, if you read Nancy Munn stuff in the business department, they just wouldn't know what to do with it, right? They wouldn't even know how to classify it as economics because it's just so far removed from what we would think of, right?
Mhm.
But this is her trying to do like a perspective on Gawa, which is like part of that Kula ring again. Uh,
Mhm.
Trobriand perspectives on exchange and economics and value and fame, right? And her critique is really that like we try to fit a lot of these systems, like someone like Gregory is trying to fit all these other weird systems into our own mode of capitalism. Say, look, it just articulates, right? With, people are just doing capitalism stuff or it works with capitalism, right? But that's not actually from their perspective what it looks like, right? So kind of again, like the Taoist, like what does it look like from their perspective? And so for her, it's all about the creation of value. And value is like a weird amorphous term that became really fetishized kind of in economic anthropology. I wrote my thesis. It's called an ethnography of value,
Mhm.
among the Maya. Um, the idea of what is quality, I guess, in a society. It's kind of it's very philosophical, but like what is good, or what is value, or what is the good life, right? Or something like that. What motivates people? And we often,
Mhm.
like in our society, are like, it's money. It's money. Like it underlies so much of our society and politics, and even things that aren't, like religion, are kind of subordinated to um, the economy in our society, right? We got people would much rather have a businessman as a president than a preacher or something. Where so
Mhm.
arguably, I'm not sure it worked out that way. But um,
Side point.
it's like, but you can kind of see where our primary values are in our society, right? We love that kind of like
Yeah.
money,
Yeah.
businessmen, you know, kind of thing. But in other societies, it's not. And so, what is this primary motivating factor? And Munn says it's like for people in this Trobriand society, right? It's fame.
Mhm.
And you can think of most again, right? So, what happens when if we trade Kula gifts, and I get your armband and you get my necklace, and then the next year you sail to someone else's, you go to Gabrielle's island and you trade her the necklace that
Mhm.
you got from me to her. What do you do when you trade that? Do you just exchange, or is there some, how does the lineage of that kind of go, that exchange?
I don't remember ever getting a specific thing, but I remember you saying, essentially, you say that this is this thing which I got from that person,
Yeah.
and then as it goes along, it's from this person to this person to this person to this person,
Yeah, and you
and
want
they
to
recite it.
chain together as many cool people as you can, right? You don't want like, oh, I got this from the C student or D student, right? I want it from
Mhm.
like, oh, this person is like the A plus trader on his island, he's like the top dog or whatever. And so what Munn is saying is that like in a Trobriand Kula type exchange, the actual value of that like necklace you're getting isn't really what's important, right? It's the fame that you get from when you trade that necklace, right? You get to list off all the cool, awesome people who had it before you, and then you get to hook your name into that chain, right? And you get to say,
Mhm.
and just like them, it's me, right? Um, and you can see this even in our own society, especially in the academy, right? People will be like, I studied under this person, right? Who you've probably heard of, or like nobody's ever like, I studied under this person you've never heard of, right? It's you're not like
Mhm.
hooking your fame to that. Or football players would be like, oh, I played with, this awesome person who you've heard of, versus like,
Mhm.
I'm not the awesome person as much, but I gained fame by, even the fifth member of, championship basketball team is still famous, but they're not as famous as the other people who they're associated with. So that's kind of what she says about fame in Gawa, is that people are willing to spend money to generate fame, right? And it's similar to potlatch in that
Yeah.
way, right? People are transferring economic wealth into prestige. And that becomes the central thing that motivates that society. And she
So
talks
what
about it in food exchanges, right? And dances and rituals and all these other things. You're creating value, right? And
Mhm.
um, you're generating prestige through all these things, and you're creating um, social relationships. You're building up, in this society, a big man is mostly, you can't just like say I'm in charge. You have to like
Yeah.
basically have an alliance. And so you have lots of children and they have lots of children, and you're married to a lot of people, and you have um, compadres on other islands. You can motivate a bunch of people to be like, yeah, Jacob, he's in charge now. And so that's what people are basically doing in these societies. And she says that like if we only look at it from like the economic perspective of, oh, look, they're engaging in capitalism and gift giving, right, that's not what's actually going on.
Mhm.
And it's, again, she's talking about, and similar to most, the way that in these societies egalitarianism is transformed into hierarchy, right? Because people who are able to um, as your name goes, as you trade these goods, right, you might live on Vanuatu or something. It's hundreds of miles from this other island, but your name eventually gets there, right? Um, and so she talks about the compression of space time, which
Hmm.
is like how widely your name is known. Think
Okay, that
about,
makes much more sense than anything I was trying to put there.
yeah, think about like Ramses the Second, ancient
Hmm.
Egypt, 5,000 years ago, right? Still known. Still, you can go see his temple. Still in the textbooks, they make movies about them, or all kinds of things, right? His fame is known versus like random peasant in Egypt, right?
Hmm.
Nobody knows who that is. Um, or so that's like a temporal compression, or you can also think of a spatial compression. So like I'm El Peasant on the island, right? I get up, I go to farm every day. I like probably go to the other village on the island sometimes, but that's mostly what I do. The chief, he's got a big old boat. It can go from here to Hawaii, and he will travel across the ocean. He has lots of kin and resources, so he can put together this big old expedition to go trade Kula values. I can't go, I'm poor, like, but he can compress space and time to like, I'm going to go over there. And that's how hierarchy creates in these societies, right? As people are able to increase their fame over distance and over time, they become more renowned, more famous, and they kind of become hierarchical, like because in a potlatch kind of way, right? Because they are
Hmm.
able to basically bid you under the table in a gift giving kind of society. Does that help a little bit with Mun stuff?
That definitely does. I
It's
don't
real dense.
remember ever seeing fame and the space time concept next to each other, so I was completely lost.
Yeah, it's real dense. It's like this whole genre of stuff that came out at the same time. Her and Marilyn Strathern and Roy Wagner were like these people who worked in Polynesia, and they kind of like fed off each other, and they're just like they're super cool, interesting ideas, but they're real dense and they're real heady. So I think she's the
Mhm.
most accessible of the three. And
That does not bode
I
well.
worked for Roy for like a year, and I still am like, I don't understand, dude. Like he's a weird dude. A lot of ayahuasca and stuff like that. A lot of seeing things in different colors, right? But it makes you get good ideas. I just
Yeah.
wasn't there. But yeah, she, and so in the same way that we talked about earlier, right, witchcraft is a negative valuation. So she talks about positive and negative valuations, right?
Mhm.
So you could, in the same way that we might think about how you spend your money, right? You could make a budget. I'm gonna spend some on food, and I'm gonna, I'm gonna. So you're basically imagine, since most of us, few of us are capitalist, some of us are, but no one here. We all sell our labor for time, right? We get a check from the
Mhm.
university. But you could think about how someone and we spend that money in different ways. You can make a budget of rent and food and whatever. But you could
Yeah.
think about your time in like a Trobriand society. How are you going to spend that time and your resources, right? Just in the same way you could budget here. So I'm going to spend some of that time putting together a big old feast, right? Or I'm going to like put together an expedition. It's going to cost this much money and this much time and need this many people to go Kula trading on, New Solomon Island or something. But you could also do negative valorations, right? So in the same way I could build myself up through these different activities, I'm going to put on a feast or something. I could like tear somebody down through witchcraft. I can spend my resources and my time to like, hex somebody or curse somebody, try to, because it's not that, you can bring yourself up to create hierarchy, but you could also bring someone down, right? And so it's a fungible system in these societies, right? And so it's an interesting way to look at economies without putting the almighty dollar at the center, right? And so we see people spending resources, like it costs money to fix your boat, right? To go on these expeditions, or it costs money to like, I'm gonna have a feast, but I don't have enough potatoes, and I need to buy something else to like help me fill in the gaps, or I need to hire a band or something, right? It costs money.
Mhm.
Uh, but it's not the center of these systems. It's all about something else. And that economics, especially like what Solons would call substantivist economics, so formalist being like Adam Smith, supply and
Mhm.
demand, substantivist being like, how does kinship and religion interface with economics, right? So from that perspective, um, we can look at a system of economics and or exchange without it being like capitalist focused or even money focused. It can be focused on exchange of things, right? So it's another kind of perspective on Moss again. So the last one we read was David Graeber. He had an
Mhm.
earlier book about value, which was a 96 or 98 book, which was um, similar to kind of Nancy Munn stuff.
Mhm.
Um, he just died like this year, I think, from coronavirus. Um, and my thesis is basically David Graeber's stuff mixed with Chris Gregory's stuff. The two things we read this week is like a structure for understanding how these peasant households in Belize, smallholding farmers, interact with both the market economy on one hand and like this whole local peasanty thing, with like kinship exchanges and giving to the church and putting on a fiesta and things like that, godparents and alliances and stuff, through local politics. So using that as a way to talk about like interface economics with politics and religion and kinship, instead of like, if you go over to the economic side of business, like they don't talk about any of that stuff, right? They're like, people just make money. You need to like lower your price to get more volume or something, right? It's not really,
Mhm.
it's like disarticulated from the rest of society. So all four of these are doing what we call substantivist. It's what Solons would call substantivist economics, looking at how it's all linked together, right? And it makes sense to us as anthropologists, right? Because just any system you're going to look at, if we're going to talk about economics this week, you're going to see it's connected to kinship, religion, language, all this other stuff. But if we next week we look at religion, right, we're also going to see it's connected to environment and economics and language, and they're all connected.
It seems like the anthropology answer to studying practically any subject is it's not that simple.
It's not that simple. It's why our thesis or dissertation in anthropology probably has more words than probably any other discipline except maybe philosophy, I would guess. Like just in terms
I'd
of
be
like
willing to
sheer
bet.
page count. And you can look at them. They used to have, when we were in Illinois, they had a wall and like whether it was a dean's office or like the arts and science, the College of Arts and Science had an area and they had all the theses on the wall. And you could see it would be like math and it would be like anthropology, like sociology. They were like philosophy was like 2 volumes or something.
Yeah.
They were definitely the longer ones. So hopefully you didn't get into anthropology to write a novella, because there's just so much to say, right?
Yeah. That's
I mean,
true.
my thesis was like 110, 115. My diss was like 350. And I'm working on turning it into a book, and I cut out 100,000 words so far, which is like almost 200 pages or 150 pages. It's just painful. It's like years of my life, just like delete, 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 like, because it's all connected and it's real hard to like make it make sense to people who don't live there, because it is all connected. So you start to talk about economics. I'm going to talk to you about how people grow cacao in Belize, right? And they're like,
Mhm.
well, hang on, let me talk to you about food first, because it's part of this food system. Like, hang on, let me talk to you about how like, but the food is like symbolic and religious, right? And, it's part of this cosmology and like, connected to certain gods. So, well, let me tell you about like religious conversion, and then let me tell you about like, decolonization and like, neoliberal economics, which changed the farming industry, so you end up like just kind of all over. So it's hard to like keep it straight ahead. And I think you'll find that, your project is nice and small. I want to study language and, toponyms and maps and stuff.
Mhm.
but it's going to be like, oh, but let me tell you about the like symbolism of this. So then I tell you about the religion to make that symbolism make sense, right? And then that's part of this whole worldview, which touches on kinship and whatever, right? So just be prepared.
Yeah, I'm aware of that one.
But it's cool. Like when it's done well, like you get to the end of an ethnography and you're like, yeah, I really like get that culture. When it's done badly, you're like, I don't understand anything that I just read. Like
Mm.
maybe like how you were with Nancy Mon, you're just like, I don't know, like those words. Um, but Graeber's second book, which he's probably most well known for, right? This is right around the same time. He was real popular in the Occupy Wall Street. He was like always on the
Mm-hmm.
news. It said that he was the most famous anthropologist since Margaret Mead, which is kind of a low bar, but you know, like she was on a postage stamp, so that's cool. But he was like on TV, like on MSNBC and stuff, you know, like at the barricades, trying to be like he's like a dyed in the wool. I guess he's dead now. He was like a dyed in the wool, like anarchist or anarcho syndicist,
Mm-hmm.
which I'm sympathetic towards. You know, like the idea that governments and like are not very, you know, like a more democratic system where people are actually in control, you know, we could actually at this point everybody could vote on your cell phones for, you know, a bill or something. You know, you could do this at that point, or you don't
Yeah.
need a manager at McDonald's to tell you what to do anymore. You could elect somebody, the most competent person of your McDonald's team, to be the boss this time or this year or this month, right? So he's like a real tear down the system, rebuild it, you know, and he comes from a classic like New York Jewish socialist, you know, like grew up singing the Internationale as like lullaby, you know, the socialist song. You know, and he lived in the same rent controlled apartment his whole life that his parents lived in from like when they immigrated from like the 50s or the 30s or whatever, right? Um, but he wrote this book is about debt, right? And the idea of debt, and debt is kind of a weird thing because it's kind of taken for granted. Most people,
Mm-hmm.
in the same way that like Sidney Mintz wrote the book about sugar, was like, hey, sugar is something you take for granted. You should think about the social history of this. It's not what you think. You know, Graeber's like, well, how about debt? And people are like, what debt? Like that's always been there, right? He's like, no, like you know, you take you're TAing 310 right now, so you know that like debt hasn't always been there. In hunter-gatherer society, there's no debt. In Neolithic farming society, 10,000 years ago, there's no debt. So, like, if we think modern Homo sapiens sapiens have been around for let's say 250,000 at least years. We only have debt for the last 5,000 years, right? And that's what he says the first 5,000 years is in the title. So, right around the time we see civilization emerge in ancient Sumeria, we get debt. It's one of those
Mm-hmm.
features of civilization. It's strange. It's just like how in that class we talked about, oh, one of the features is monumental architecture and, you know, hierarchy and standing army and religious practitioners, you know. One of them is monetary policy and debt. So it's a weird thing. How does this happen? And what are the consequences of that, the creation of debt? And so what does Graeber say? Do you remember?
He says that it grew out of war in some sense, in that if you surrender, then the person who's on the other side can either kill you or take you as a slave. And the fact that he didn't kill you makes you have a life debt to that person.
Yeah, right. So we see the beginning of inequality, and that was, you know, we just talked about that in 310. That's one of those theories for why civilization arises, like the oasis theory of V. Gordon Child, right? There starts to be less and less resources, so you get these cities. You can't, like, if you're a farmer, you can't go move around. I can't just like go somewhere else because I live by the river. That's where there's water in the desert. And so we get warfare, take some people as slaves, or you make them like, if we're not going to take you, give us all your stuff, right? Give us your gold or your treasure or whatever you got, you know, and we're going to get rich and then we're probably going to come for you again later. and take your land. Um, and so we start to see kind of that inequality. We also start to see exchange. And he talks about how there is a difference between kind of exchange and currency and debt, right? And how they don't all happen at the same time. I'm trying to look up where. Um, oh yeah, 2,000 years. Virtual money comes before debt, right? In the form of tabs and expense accounts, right? And so there's this tendency for people to think, well, debt is just like this natural part of exchange, right? I got something, I want it now, but like, I don't have the money, so I'll go into debt or get credit. But what he's saying is that this didn't happen overnight, and it's not a natural part of the system. It was like created, right? Um, and then we see this kind of slow transformation from what Marx would say, right, the commodity to commodity exchange, C to C, to that M or CMC, right, that we start to have kind of tabs, right? And I will, I have 5 cows to sell you. You have chickens, but I don't really want chickens right now. But you can have these like good for 3 cows later or something, or something.
And then
Or
also
I'll just take a.
and then also the fact that most of that debt, I believe it was Mesopotamia, had a system to where after a certain amount of time, everyone's debt was gone.
Yeah, yeah, and we see
And
this
how
in a
that didn't
number of
carry
cultures
over.
around the world, like the Jubilee idea. But yeah, and then to go from those kind of accounts, especially with some of the first writing that we see in Mesopotamia, is accounts. They'll put like a little thing written on clay, then they'll put it inside another clay envelope and then fire it, so you can't like change it without breaking it, right? Receipts. But eventually, like this idea of debt and like using debt as a form of power, right? And it almost takes on this like potlatch kind of sense, right? That you can get crushed under debt or you can get buried under debt, and we see this a lot with people with student debt in our society, right? It has like a lot of power to impact their lives. So I want to work for a nonprofit, but I got $100,000 in debt, right? Or I'm going to join the army so I can go out of, so they'll help me go to school so I don't have this debt, and so it becomes a political tool or a tool of government or a tool of commerce to kind of manipulate people or manipulate society, right? Yeah, let's see. He talked about the difference between virtual money and commodity money. Do you know what the difference between those are?
Virtual money is not based on anything that's like immediately apparent of like a statue or a piece of gold.
Yeah. And so which do we have today? Do you know?
We definitely have virtual money. I think you
Yeah.
said something like 98% of the money in the world system is debt
Yeah.
of virtual money.
And that's relatively recent, right? Like Nixon, until like Nixon, it was still on the silver standard. So you could go, each US dollar was backed by a certain amount of silver. And you could like hypothetically go to the bank and be like, I want my silver. And they'll give you, $100 worth of silver, like a piece or something, But yeah, this switch towards virtual money. And he has this interesting thing about the kind of oscillation between virtual money and commodity money um, as like a cycles of capitalism. So yeah, I don't know what it means and what do you think would be the next, if we're on a cycle of virtual money and we're due for a commodity, what do you think the next commodity could be?
I would think since this is the most, um, well, it'd be hard to figure it out because there's so many different metals, but something along the lines of something very valuable in the sense of like electronic type things.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't even know. it could be something like, depending on how dystopian we get, fresh air or something, or
Honestly,
or it could even be something
yeah,
like computing power, right? Like teraflops or something,
that might be
the
the next
Google
one.
the Google standard, against how much server space you have or something. I don't know.
And that would be an interesting one because then do you call it virtual money at that point? Is it
Mm-hmm.
still virtual money
Mm-hmm. Virtual commodities, like, or you
or
know,
Bitcoin?
blockchain. Yeah, blockchain was like a way to like, it's almost a way of trying to get back onto the commodity side through virtual,
Yeah.
because you're basically, well, all you're doing with blockchain is you're taking energy, or you're converting energy into computation. So it's kind of like in almost a Nancy Munn way, right? You're flexing your power, right? I can, make 10,000 computers compute some random equation that has no purpose.
Hmm.
So therefore, I have economic value. It's an interesting way to look at it. But yeah, I think Graeber's stuff is cool, especially the historical aspect of it, right? Looking at
Hmm.
debt through time. The other ones are kind of ethnographic more. This is more of a ethnological. And then also kind of how he positions it as a way of like applied. A lot of his stuff is like, now you've read my book, to the barricades, right? Tear down capitalism. This is not just like, oh, mongo bongo bongo, they do this interesting thing, right? He's uses it as a
This
critique
is
of capitalism in order to like change it. What are you saying?
this is kind of unrelated to the main theme of this, but where does he get the thought that Comte was a crypto fascist?
Well, that's what I think, that I don't know exactly where, but as an anarchist and kind of on the far left, like
I suppose, yeah.
he's more likely to,
Says people are crypto fascists. Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
I mean, yeah, he'll drop the fascist label pretty, unlike George W. or something, like he's not afraid to drop it. Um, but yeah, I don't know about that. Um, but interesting ideas, especially with how debt allows the government or the royalty, or the parliament, or however you want to, whatever system you're in, a way to either provide resources for the people through the market, or to manipulate the markets towards political ends, right? And we have this in our own society. The government's always like, oh, we're giving grain subsidies, or we are, we're going to send you a $1,200 stimulus check to like keep the economy going. Like this is all, it's not like they have that money in the bank. This is all debt financed, you know, projects. So, but it's interesting. It's four different perspectives on economics, like modern anthropological economics is kind of what I would say, um, and how they interface both with like global capitalism, but also kind of these peripheral peoples, and how peripheral peoples can speak to capitalism. And Graeber does a similar thing, but rather than peripheral peoples using long history, right? We're not going to ask ethnographically, we're going to look archaeologically at ancient Sumeria as a comparison to today. So all are like kind of this underlying contrast between modern global capitalism and some other economic-y type system, which helps point out these flaws or troubles, or even just things that are we consider natural but are actually constructed and historical.
Oh yeah, also the classes thing.
Yeah, cool. So what'd you think of economics?
Other than the Nancy Munn thing, it was really interesting. I can side a little bit with Graeber, but at the same time, I'm like, maybe not.
Yeah, my professor was Fred, not Fred, Fred Damon at UVA, and he was a Polynesianist. There's a whole bunch of Polynesian, Melanesianists there. Worked on cool stuff, contemporary of Nancy Munn, and he was like an economic anthropologist. So him and his student Mike Uzendusky, who is my thesis advisor, were like real big into like this kind of new economic anthropology kind of stuff. And so his stuff was Kula, Polynesia, and then Mike stuff was South America, like rainforesty type people who would trade between the rainforest and then lived at the base of the Andes Mountains. And so would trade with the people up in the mountains, but also the people in the jungle, and like how they created social value through kinship and ritual and stuff. So it was very much in that vein. So let's take a look at your